A lie is like a seed. Once planted, it will either thrive or fail. Lying can be convenient, prosperous, even necessary. But how many think about the seeds they plant? When planting a yew tree, would someone consider that they would die before they see it reach maturity? How after 1,000 years, the tangled roots and branches of that same tree may have spread to forever change the ecosystem around it. Lies are like seeds. Once planted, they can outlive and outpace the liar. What might seem inconsequential in the present can have grand consequences as time unfolds. A lie can change history forever. But it's the lies that resist exposure that are most troublesome. When you know someone is lying but you cannot irrefutably prove it. You feel it in your core, but it is your instinct against their word. What would that sort of lie do to the course of history and time?
Human memories, ideas, culture, history.
We've always kept records of our lives, through words, pictures, symbols, from tablets to books.
But not all the information was inherited by later generations. A small percentage of the whole was selected and processed, then passed on. Not unlike genes, really.
That's what history is, Jack.
During the Middle Ages, reading and writing were skills very few possessed. There were not public libraries stacked full of books and accessible by the majority like there is today. Most of the historical books were kept in monasteries. European monasteries were vast complexes managed by Christian monks, whose lives were ones divided by worship and hard labour in managing the self-sufficiency of the site. But reading was also a priority for monks, so much so that it was integrated into monastic rules, ensuring a duty to see that no brother is to waste time or engage in idle talk to the neglect of his reading. And, as scholar Stephen Greenblatt states, this obligatory reading was enough to set in motion an extraordinary chain of consequences. For a problem soon arose. Reading required books. Books that were opened again and again eventually fell apart, however carefully they were handled. In the absence of a commercial book market, monastic rules began to insist that monks not only learn to make parchment, but also transcribe and copy texts by hand. As one Benedictine monastic rule reads, "He who does not turn up the earth with the plough ought to write the parchment with his fingers." This was the beginning of the scriptoria, or scriptoriums. More and more monasteries aimed to hold a vast collection of books in their libraries. Fashioned with clear glass windows for optimal light, scriptoriums were workshops where monks sat for hours copying text. Producing parchment was laborious. Since paper did not come into general use until the 14th century, for more than 1,000 years the chief writing material used for books was made from the skins of animals. Good parchment was far too valuable and scarce to be discarded, and this value placed upon parchment helps to account for the fact that monasteries collected ancient pagan manuscripts and did not consign them to the rubbish.
Italians had been obsessed with book hunting for the better part of a century, ever since the poet and scholar Petrarch brought glory on himself around 1330 by piecing together the history of Rome and finding forgotten masters by Cicero, Propertius, and others. Petrarch's achievement had inspired others to seek out lost classics that had been lying unread, often for centuries. The recovered texts were copied, edited, commented upon, and eagerly exchanged, forming the basis for what became known as the study of humanities. The humanists, as those who were devoted to this study were called, knew from carefully poring over the texts that had survived from classical Rome that many once famous books, or parts of books, were still missing. The humanists knew that some of these missing works were likely to have been lost forever, but they suspected that others, perhaps many others, were hidden away in dark places, not only in Italy, but across the Alps. The prime hunting grounds were the libraries of old monasteries. For centuries, monasteries had been virtually the only institutions that cared about books.
Monks spent hours upon hours copying text by hand in the scriptorium, under the direction of the chief librarian. And the scriptorium had strict rules. There was no access to non-scribes. Silence was kept at all times. Scribes were not given a choice in the books they copied. They did not work at night, as candlelight was not permitted near the books. Standard copiers would use pens, ink and penknives. Some worked with finer tools, rulers, awls, fine metal pointed pens, reading frames, page weights. Some manuscripts were illuminated, in which monks would spend countless hours crafting with specialized tools. The work was hard and long, and on some manuscripts you can still see notations from the monks in the margins. Thank God it will be dark soon. Now I've written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink.
Monks were strictly forbidden to change what they thought were mistakes in the text they were copying. They could correct only their own slips of the pen by carefully scraping off the ink with a razor and repairing the spot with a mixture of milk, cheese, and lime, the medieval version of our own production for whiting out mistakes. There was no crumpling up the page and starting fresh. Monastic scribes had been forced to copy everything exactly as it appeared before their eyes, even those things that made no sense. There were a certain number of abbots and of monastic librarians who treasured not only the parchment, but also the pagan works written on them. Steeped in classical literature, some believed that they could rifle its treasures without contamination. But over generations, as a substantial Christian literature was created, it became less easy to make such an argument. Between the 6th century and in the middle of the 8th century, Greek and Latin classics virtually ceased to be copied at all. What had begun as an active campaign to forget, a pious attack on pagan ideas, had evolved into actual forgetting. The classics had been reduced to the condition of mute things, sheets of parchment, stitched together, covered with unread words.
It was only because of the high value placed upon parchment that the writings of the ancients were kept alive at all. And, as the humanist book hunter knew, even strong material was no guarantee of survival. Working with knives, brushes and rags, monks often carefully washed away the old writings and wrote in their place the text that they were instructed by their superiors to copy. If the original ink proved tenacious, it could still be possible to make out the traces of the texts that were written over. A unique 4th century copy of Cicero's On the Republic remained visible beneath a 7th century copy of St. Augustine. The sole surviving copy of Seneca's book on friendship was deciphered beneath an Old Testament, inscribed in the late 6th century. These strange, layered manuscripts, called palimpsests, have served as a source of several major works from the ancient past that would not otherwise be known. And it's the hoarding and copying of ancient manuscripts where things become quite interesting. It all centers around a crew of literary men, the book hunters, and a specific man named Poggio Bracciolini.
All writings which are commonly thought to be old are in fact, with certain exceptions, supposititious, and the fabrication of an unprincipled crew of literary men. They were bound to forge almost countless literary monuments. A vast number of volumes was prepared, because the wicked forgers knew that the more there were, the more difficult it would be to unravel the fraud. They were forged in the 14th century, but they could scarce be read until they were printed, and this was mostly done in the 16th century. During the close of the 14th century, throughout the 15th, and at the commencement of the 16th, books were constantly being recovered, under distressingly suspicious circumstances. Exactly the Roman author that was wanted turned up. and always for a certainty that Roman author for whom the highest price had been offered. For the discovery of manuscripts of the ancient classics, which when long looked for, and not found, were usually from too tempting reward, which was a fortune, forged by some unscrupulous writer of Latin. A little band of men lived in Rome. All were famous for their abilities. Poggio Bracciolini possessed the plastic power that makes the forger, writing in a great variety of styles and manners. The Scaligerian chronology of Rome is constructed upon a most flimsy foundation indeed.
The historical scenario of monks preserving texts in guarded libraries, and the process of handwritten transcription and copying on parchment is enough to make one suspicious. At minimum, information could and would have been lost in translation and transcription. A larger problem is the ideology of religion. Would a religious order really preserve the history of the pagan ancient world with fidelity and non-bias? The scriptoriums throw into sharp focus the unreliability that characterizes Europe's pre-Renaissance handwritten history. But the words of Jean Ardois, John Wilson Ross, and Anatoly Fomenko take this unreliability into the realm of conspiracy, as they introduce the concept of mass forgery. Scholars have written extensively on the matter of literary forgery, some of the more famous examples being the infamous letter of Prester John and the donation of Constantine. And not only were these forgeries accepted by contemporary society as legitimate, but they also went on to change the course of history. For a lie is like a seed. As Umberto Eco writes in regard to the donation, without that document, without a profound belief in its authenticity, European history would have followed a different course. No conflict over investitures, no mortal struggle for the Holy Roman Empire, no temporal power of the popes, no slap at Agnani, and also no Sistine Chapel. The donation of Constantine was copied and translated by hand on parchment extensively during the Middle Ages. It is startling to consider just how easy it may have been for monks and others to forge handwritten documents and ascribe them to earlier dates in the historical timeline. That the monastic scriptoriums may have, perhaps, functioned as forges for producing mass forgeries. The world that Poggio Bracciolini and his associates, the book hunters, inhabited was one of a burgeoning new age, and what has latterly been termed the Renaissance. The humanists were casting off the shackles of what was then perceived as the Dark Ages of their immediate religious past, and looking back to their more ancient history with wonder and the longing for a lost world. A lost world that they believed was more technologically and socially advanced than their current one. And providing that Ardois and others are correct, that a good portion of manuscripts documenting ancient history were fabricated during the Renaissance, then the question remains, why? Did this band of humanists, in their longing for a lost civilization, just let their imagination get the better of them? Or were they just greedy, fortune-seeking individuals? For as Ross and the correspondence of the time tells us, there was a tempting reward, which was a fortune, offered by society's elite for finding lost manuscripts. But while fantasy and greed, and not to mention fame, would have certainly driven the book hunters, when we look closer at the life of Poggio Bracciolini, something bigger and more concerning surfaces. Poggio wasn't just a learned man with a thirst for lost history. Throughout his life he moved alongside the upper echelons of society. He had served 7 popes through his apostolic secretary role. And not only that, but he was also excellent friends with and receiving patronage from the Medici family, one of the most powerful banking families in history. And when looking at all the humanists, from Petrarch and Boccaccio to Poggio himself, they were all entwined with ultra-elite nobles. like the Orsinis or Medicis. These are the same Medicis that produced 4 popes, countless dukes, and whose bloodline ended up running through various royal families in Spain, France and Britain. Poggio was, as William Meehan writes, Cosimo Medici's chief book scout. Medici's involvement in the book hunters' enterprise surpassed meagre funding. He was financing all their trips. He employed countless copyists to transcribe manuscripts and founded the first public library in Florence, which specialized in texts from antiquity and the humanist movement.
The great thing with him and his companions was, when they could not find to forge, all they had to ascertain was simply which ancient Roman was particularly wanted and would fetch the highest price. And as the band consisted of men of genius, of different tastes or faculties, poetical, historical, or narrative, philosophical, grammatical, or critical, and scientific or mathematical, if the reward was sufficiently munificent to pay for the time and labor, the highly valued work that was wanted, no matter to what department of literature it belonged, was sure to turn up, sooner or later, and if the man who was to forge was not in the proper mood of inspiration for the business, some other fabricated writer was put forward.
For Ardois, Ross, Fomenko and others, the immediate and obvious signs pointing to mass forgery of pre-Renaissance texts are the parallels between the events documented in those texts with contemporary events of the end of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance itself. They also all highlight the irregularities when it comes to the Latin and Greek in which they were written. In the French language, we see the greatest changes in the course of 500 years. But in the Greek fathers and historians, there is not the slightest vestige of a change in the language during an alleged period of 1,500 years. All use the same dialect and the same syntax. In his investigation into Poggio's potential forgery of the Annals of Tacitus, a key work for our modern understanding of the history of the Roman Empire, Ross presents a multitude of arguments, including countless errors and peculiarities relating to its literary composition and its Latin, how various coins and monuments directly contradict the narrative, geographical errors, resemblances to Poggio's own writing, the anomalies between the Annals and other ancient texts. As Ross states, the author of the Annals knew more about prominent individuals in Rome than was known to their distinguished contemporaneous countrymen. And finally, anachronistic references to Poggio's era and the parallels between accounts in the history and the 1400s. Just like Ardois and Fomenko, Ross notes that heaps of passages in the Annals read like incidents in the 15th century. And Ross wasn't alone in his cynicism. Even French satirist Voltaire suspected the Annals were a forgery. For Ross, however, Ardois is extreme in his designation of almost all texts predating the Renaissance as forgeries. Nobody at the present day considers what he said about the literary monuments of antiquity worthy of the slightest attention. And this is because Ardois was arguing that all of antiquity was forged and fabricated to discredit the truth of the Catholic Church. Ross's criticism of Ardois would no doubt have extended to Fomenko too, in his nationalistic attempt to discredit all pre-Renaissance texts and claim a huge cover-up of a vast unified Russian empire. For Ross, the deception is trickier and more nuanced. He acknowledges that it is likely that many Greek texts from antiquity are real, and it was from those that the Latin ones, the history of the Romans, was invented. He agrees with Ardois when he states one is almost inclined to give Father Ardois credit for being quite right, when he expressed as his belief that perhaps not more than 2 or 3 of the ancient Latin classics were really written by the old Romans. And this is the genius of the forgery operation, and how it was successful in the first place, because the truth and the lies, the real and the forged, are mixed in with each other so much that it is very difficult to evidence. The forgery is anything but plain and palpable. Nay, it is wonderfully obscure and monstrously difficult. And providing they are correct, how was a vast conspiracy of forgery like this even possible in the first place, or pulled off convincingly? AEWAR outlines a potential process clearly. Firstly, before the printing press became widespread and the norm, the general public did not have easy access to these manuscripts. Although they were forged in the 14th century, they could scarce be read until they were printed, and this was mostly done in the 16th century. Secondly, it was necessary that the book should be written on parchment, so that they might keep up the lie of great antiquity and be longer preserved. Handwritten parchment not only allowed forgers to make manuscripts appear older than they were, but also allowed various copies, whether prepared in monasteries or by Cosimo Medici's copyists, to be produced, predated, and then subsequently hidden in various locations. But that means there would have been a diverse amount of players involved. Wouldn't someone speak out? Especially in monastic circles where religious piety was prioritized. Describing Renaissance Italy after his first visit to Rome, Luther said, "Everything is permitted there except to be an honest man." And Poggio himself captures this society of hypocrisy well when describing his visit to the Baths of Baden in 1416. Abbots, monks, friars and priests comported themselves with more licentiousness than the laity, laid aside all thoughts of religion, and sometimes bathed with women, whose hair they decked with ribbons and wreaths of flowers. Given this account, it would not be absurd to assume that many abbots and monks would commit acts of impiety, accept bribery money, or were even compromised by others. Thirdly, and most importantly, the genius of the lie relies on the forgers creating a web of intertextuality. Intertextuality is when one text references another text. The pestiferous gang joined forces in the writing of history, hence they very often copy one another, and they overwhelmed readers with the number of books, and so made it harder to believe that the suspicion of fraud and falsehood was well founded. A key example of intertextuality is the alleged work of Quintilian, whose texts reference many other writers, such as Marcus Pacuvius and Cornelius Severus in passing. Another example is the Annals of Tacitus. Modern scholars dismiss Ross's claims that Poggio forged the Annals because Book 15 of the Annals is referenced in Giovanni Boccaccio's commentary on Dante, which was written before Poggio was born. And it's true, both Boccaccio's text and the Annals align. But, according to Ross, AEWAR and others, this intertextuality is the genius of the lie. Although writing before Poggio was born, Boccaccio belonged to the first generation of book hunters in Italy. And if we entertain the idea that they were running a wholesale forgery operation, then it would be in the forger's interest to leave references to other, yet to be discovered texts as to ensure the longevity of the fraudulent business, creating opportunities for fellow and future book hunters to generate more forgeries. It would also work as a perfect tactic in ensuring that the texts were never discovered to be forgeries, as they were referenced elsewhere and earlier in time. And if correct, this dedication to carefully crafted intertextuality really is the success of the forgery, for it prevents any forgery from being conclusively proven. Unless undeniable evidence is presented demonstrating ancient texts to be forged, intertextuality will always keep the majority of scholars fixed to the idea that the texts are authentic, even though academia acknowledges that there were indeed forgeries during this period, such as Consolatio, a text allegedly written by the ancient Cicero that was discovered by humanist and book hunter Carolus Sigonius in 1583. On his deathbed, Carolus admitted that he forged the text, and it is now widely accepted as a fake. Ross finds it highly unconvincing that these ancient texts would have been so mistreated and misplaced over the centuries.
It's almost unbelievable that such people would treat them as swine treat pearls, spurn them, not keep them in libraries, but throw them away as useless lumber into cellars, pits, dark holes, dirty passages, dry wells. And who would think of looking for books in such places, he asks. And yet it was precisely in such places that the book hunters looked for the books that they wanted. What is still stranger, they always found in such queer places the exact books they were in search of. When they recovered books in the monastery of St. Gal, the books were not found where they ought to have been, on account of their excellence, on the shelves of the library, but where slugs and toads are more frequently looked for, and found then books and manuscripts, in an exceedingly dirty and dark dungeon, at the bottom of a tower. The circumstances surrounding the discovery of many alleged ancient lost texts is highly suspicious and coincidental. More often than not, they were found in darkness, in a blind dungeon, in a dirty dungeon, in dismal dungeons.
The many coincidences, conveniences, and circumstances are very suspicious. And when looking closer at the correspondence between Poggio and his partner Niccolo Nicolai, we find suggestion that they were, indeed, up to no good. Under the patronage of Cosimo Medici, Nicolai, a fellow humanist and copyist, was responsible for building up a personal library of 800 manuscripts, which now reside in the Medici-founded Laurentian Library. Detailing the years leading up to the so-called rediscovery of the Annals of Tacitus, Ross informs us that Poggio, then a resident in Rome, began to forge a work with the intention of palming it off upon the world as written by an ancient Roman. As one of Poggio's early biographers recounts, in 1422 Piero Lamberteschi offered Poggio a situation, the nature of which is not precisely known, but which was probably that of a public professor in one of the Italian universities. The situation, the nature of which was unknown, and which would earn Poggio in 3 years 500 gold sequins, was, according to Ross, to forge a lost text, most likely the Annals. As he explains, Nicolai was at the bottom of this, advising his friend to undertake the task, and frequently corresponding by letter discussing the matter. And while this early biographer speculates that the offer was to take up a position as a public professor in a university, Poggio's letters to Nicolai suggest the offer was of a different nature. Poggio writes, "I like the occupation to which he has invited me, and I hope I shall be able to produce something worth reading." But as Ross points out, professors in those days did not collect their lectures and publish them. They could not then produce something worth reading. Poggio also writes that if I were to see that I should get that which our friend Piero expects, I would go not only to the end of Europe, but as far as to the wilds of Tartary. Again reinforcing that the task was to produce something that would reward him with a small fortune, to retire and travel far and wide. In another letter to Nicolai, dated 10th of June 1422, Poggio writes, "I want you to have no distrust. Give me the leisure and the time for writing that history, and I will do something you approve. When I reflect on the merits of the ancient writers of history, I recoil with fear from the undertaking." And on the 8th of October 1423, Poggio writes, "Beginnings of any kind being arduous and difficult, what the ancients did pleasantly, quickly, and easily, was to him troublesome, tedious, and burdensome." No mention of writing that history occurs again in correspondence between Poggio and Nicolai. But a few years later, there is a suggestion that rumours had got abroad regarding what was transpiring between the two. And Poggio writes to Nikolai, reassuring him that when Tacitus came, he would keep it a secrecy, that he knew all the tittle-tattle that was going on, but have no fear, for that not a syllable should escape him. If Poggio was just about to receive the lost histories written by Tacitus, why, Ross asks, would you want to keep it secret? Wouldn't it be better to make noise of it abroad immediately, and as publicly as could be, so that it might be known to a wide circle of book collectors, and as large a sum got for it as could be obtained? And what exactly was that history which Poggio was trying to write and feeling pressured to match the style of the ancient writers? All of this suggests that not only were Poggio and Nikolai involved in secretive business pertaining to writing, but that they were extremely careful as to not specifically reference the particulars of their business in correspondence. It has all the markings of a sophisticated criminal operation, one very aware that it must leave minimal trace, for letters could be intercepted back then. Any hint at forgery would ruin their scheme and reputation. But more importantly, this kind of caution when it comes to private letters suggests that perhaps they were working with a greater foresight in mind, perhaps anticipating how their letters may be interpreted by future historians. Poggio and the book hunters would have no doubt been motivated by money. But why were the Medicis, one of the richest banking families in Italy, financing this whole operation? Could they have been deliberately forging history with the foresight of future generations in mind? They've certainly covered their tracks, erased all conclusive evidence to the point where forgery cannot be proven or disproved, and all that remains is an abundance of suspicious coincidences and circumstances. The lies that resist exposure are the most troublesome. When you know someone is lying, but you cannot irrefutably prove it. You feel it in your core, but it is your instinct against their word. What would that sort of lie do to the course of history and time? Could our pre-Renaissance history have been forged? If we consider this notion, that even a small fraction of the texts from antiquity were fabricated during the Renaissance, then the timeline begins to distort and collapse under the weight of unreliability, and the certainty surrounding written history ends right here. And to seriously consider this means to play a dangerous game, because it creates a boundless historical absence. What's to stop a nefarious entity from forging and filling this absence with whatever fantasy they see fit and that serves their own agenda? And perhaps that's what the book hunters were doing, filling a great absence with an ideal vision of Rome that never existed, all for the purpose of serving the political and technological agenda of an obscure entity. And what entity? Orsini, Medici, the Italian nobility, Shadow Rome. And if the books were forged, then where are all the legitimate pre-Renaissance texts? Why is there an absence here in the first place? Because, as Victor Hugo tells us, before the invention of the printing press, architecture was the primary mode of language. Our ancestors wrote their chronicles, stories, histories in stone. The invention of the printed book destroyed this method of memory.
But in the current digitized world, trivial information is accumulating every second, preserved in all its triteness, never fading, always accessible. All of this junk data, preserved in an unfiltered state, growing at an alarming rate.
It will only slow down social progress, reduce the rate of evolution. What we propose to do is not to control content, but to create context.
It's our responsibility as rulers. Just as in genetics, unnecessary information and memory must be filtered out to stimulate the evolution of the species. Who else could wade through the sea of garbage you people produce, retrieve valuable truths, and even interpret their meaning for later generations?
That's what it means to create context.
We are on the cusp of a burgeoning new age that will be run by AI technology. AI technology that already has the capability to forge and fabricate the historical narrative. It is only a matter of time before groups once again trifle with the historical record for their own gain. Let's play our own hand at this dangerous game. Could there exist another lead outside of writing that suggests Roman history is a forgery? It's time to put forth a hypothesis and look closer at a very important book that was rediscovered during the Renaissance and its relationship to this kind of classical architecture. We need to go to Florence and examine this, for it is this dome that has come to shape all our histories in its own particular way and offers us clues as to why it was perhaps necessary to forge history.